Hey folks, Professor Gray here, ready to talk to you more about one sample hypothesis test. Once you've determined the outcome to a hypothesis test, in particular whether you reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject it, the next step is to interpret the outcome in terms of the original claim and context. Here are the steps for that. The first step is to identify the claim, and it is very helpful to do this at the very beginning when you set up your hypotheses. In an earlier video, that's exactly what we did. When we set up the alternative and null hypothesis, we labeled the claim with a C in parentheses. H sub 0, the null, was the claim. The next step when interpreting is to do one of two things. If the claim is H sub 0, you either reject the claim or determine that there's not enough evidence to reject the claim. If the claim is the alternative, you either support the claim or determine there's not enough evidence to support the claim. Well, we use these terms because of the logical basis that is going on whenever we reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. If the claim is the null, then we either reject the claim because we've rejected the null, or we determine we don't have enough evidence to reject the claim if we don't have enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. If the claim is the alternative, then we support the claim if we can reject the null, or we determine there's not enough evidence to support the claim if we cannot reject the null hypothesis. Here's a convenient chart that illustrates these options. For example, if we reject H sub 0 and the claim is H sub 1, then we would support the claim and put that in context of the original problem. So for number 9, let's interpret the results of our running example in terms of the original claim. As stated just a few moments ago, the original claim was the null, H sub 0. And we conducted our test and found that we rejected the null hypothesis. So to interpret that, we would say that we reject the claim that, and now put it in to the original context of the original problem. And when I put that in context, we get that we reject the claim that 63% of people in the U.S. favor outlawing cigarettes. Again, we reject the claim because the claim was the null hypothesis, H sub 0, and the result of our hypothesis test was that we had enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis based upon the rare event rule for inferential statistics. Here are some things to watch for when you conduct hypothesis tests. Which hypothesis is the claim? It's always useful to label that at the very beginning when you set up the hypotheses. What type of test should be used? Is this a proportion test, 1 prop z? Is this a test of means with the sigma or standard deviation of the population known? That would be a z-test. Is it a t-test in which we're testing the mean and we don't know the population standard deviation? That's a t-test. Which tails are used? Is it a left-tailed test, a right-tailed test, or two-tailed? Be sure that you correctly enter which tail in the calculator. How does alpha compare to p? Is alpha bigger or is p bigger? Add zeros to the end of alpha if you need to. That will not change the value of a decimal number to add zeros to the right-hand side of it. And then which is the correct interpretation? In the next video, we'll do more examples of hypothesis testing with one sample.